Hong Kong police have banned the application of public processions on Saturday, citing concerns over people's safety.
Police have prohibited the public meeting and objected the public procession. The objection is in the interest of public safety and public order and protection and right and freedom of others citizens. We believe there's a very high chance.
The police official did not mention the applicants of the Saturday rally. He said that there are fears that some radical protesters might resort to acts of violence. Meanwhile, prominent activists Joshua Wong and Agnes Chow have been arrested on Friday. Authorities have accused them of inciting others to participate in an unauthorized assembly. Hong Kong's police say some 900 people have been arrested since anti-government rallies began in early June. The rallies broke out against the now suspended extradition bill, but they later turned into calls for reforms. The protests have turned violent on some occasions. And joining us for more on that is Stephen Rebet, our own correspondent in Beijing. We also have Jason Unruhe, political commentator and analyst, joining us from Ontario. Mr. Rebet, if I could start with you, if you can please fill us in with the latest details you have there in China regarding Hong Kong and the disturbing attacks that we've seen on police law enforcement officers.
Well, the demonstrations were applied for by the Civil Human Rights Front in Hong Kong. Now, these kind of demonstrations, they haven't been given permission for a number of weeks now, but they've still gone ahead. By and large, the kind of mass demonstrations have been peaceful, although sometimes violence has erupted. At the same time, however, there have been hit-and-run demonstrations by more militant, more violent demonstrators who've been erecting roadblocks, besieging police stations, and engaging in extreme tactics, using Molotov cocktails, attacking vehicles, attacking police. These are the kind of demonstrations or riots, basically, that the police are on the lookout for. So although the demonstrations applied for, the Civil Human Rights Front has actually said it will abide by the ruling. However, it's likely that these demonstrations will go ahead. They will likely be peaceful, but at the same time, it's also likely that this weekend we will see a lot of violent rioting, you could call it more accurately.
Right.
Would you like me to tell you about Joshua Wong? He's not, the demonstrations now don't really have an identifiable figurehead, a leader. He was big in the umbrella movement in 2014. The more violent demonstrations we've seen recently, he has no link really. So it's interesting that he's been arrested under suspicion of organizing unauthorized demonstrations.
Right.
The Western media have portrayed him, they've lionized him as this kind of freedom fighter. What they don't tend to mention is his kind of links to what you might call the US's regime change apparatus. His organization, Demosisto, has received a lot of funding from the National Endowment for Democracies, which people identify as a front for the CIA. He's been welcomed in Washington and been, welcomed by people like Marco Rubio and Tom Cotton, and then organizations like the Heritage Foundation and Freedom House. I mean, all of these
that's where China's been accusing the United States of interference. If I can turn to Mr. Unruhe, do you think the level of restraint being shown by Hong Kong police, is that being taken for granted by the protesters?
I certainly do think so. I mean, I think that these police have tolerated a great deal of violence against them. If you saw riots like these taking place in many European countries, you would see a great deal of violence being carried out back against them by those said police. If we even saw riots or unrest like this in the United States, I mean, we could almost guarantee that protesters would eventually be killed killed by police forces. So that I think that these police have been very tolerant thus far of the amount of violence that's been carried out against them, and I think that the police should be taking greater actions in order to be able to defend themselves against these rioters, because what we're seeing is not just violence against police. So time and time again on YouTube, Youku, and other video sharing sites, what we see is acts of violence being carried out against innocent people. We have people walk through an airport and say that they don't support them, keep walking, and then these protesters stop them, yell at them, get in their face, and sometimes shove them and end up hitting them, and even multiple people beating on one person. We've even seen this happen with people who are foreigners who are just visiting the country.
All right. And Mr. Unruhe, how do you see the demonstrations, the riots in Hong Kong? How do you think that's going to play out at the end?
I think probably in the end, the protesters aren't going to get what it is that they want. Now, a lot of their demands are particularly vague. They just seem to be generally anti-mainland in general. Their demand is that the mainland authorities simply cease all activities or all communications with the government in Hong Kong, which is simply a nonsense demand. This is Hong Kong is China, and it very, very obviously is. And the mainland does have authority, just as the federal government has authority over any province or state in any country. I mean, this is just simply nonsense. What these protesters are demanding is essentially secession. And this kind of thing, given the very nature of it, the desire to take Hong Kong and hand it over to an imperialist power, many of them were waving American flags, some of them waving British flags, which completely baffles me. They're just trying to tear the country apart, and the Chinese government, the Chinese state in general, is not obligated to carry out or to obey these kinds of nonsensical wishes. So I don't see the protesters as going to win.
Sure. Thank you very much for your contribution, Mr. Unruhe, and I'd like to thank Stephen Ribet, our correspondent in Beijing. Jason Unruhe is a political commentator and analyst who joined us from Ontario. Dear viewers, I'm afraid that's the end of this segment of News Review. Thank you very much for staying tuned.